Have a pleasant and blessed day, everyone. Welcome to our video presentation of Albert Camus' essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. I am Jodi, Richie, Torres, together with my partner,
yours truly. My name is Ralion, Angelo, and we are from Black A Class THX1 under the supervision of Professor Ian Kalika of Bachelor of Arts in Applied Psychology program, all the way from University of the Philippines Diliman Extension Program in Pampanga. And now let's learn together in philosophy as we present our report. Let's go!
And now, let's proceed to RE, The Myth of Sisyphus, a group presentation prepared by
Ralion, Angelo, and Jodi, Richie, Torres, made with Animaker.
Who is Albert Camus? Albert Camus was born way back 1913 and died year 1916. He was a journalist, editor and editorialist, playwright and director, novelist and author of short stories, political essayist and activist. And although he more than once denied it, he was a legitimate philosopher. He ignored or opposed systematic philosophy, had little faith in rationalism, asserted rather than argued many of his main ideas, presented others in metaphors, was preoccupied with immediate and personal experience, and brooded over such questions as the meaning of life in the face of death. Although he forcefully separated himself from existentialism, Camus posed one of the 20th century's best-known existentialist questions, which launches the myth of Sisyphus, which is there is only one really serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. It is according from Stanford Encyclopedia. Part number 1, the birth of the absurd. According to Albert Camus, at any street corner, the feeling of absurdity can strike any man in the face. You might just be going about your daily business, living what Camus refers to as mechanical life. We grow into the habit of doing before acquiring the habit of thinking. That is true. You might be doing the dishes, eating out with your date, watching televisions, sleeping and reading on the couch, doing workouts. Then it hits you. You grow weary with the current state of your life. You start asking for answers why you do the stuff you do every day. Somehow, without the concept of God or similar beings or an objective meaning, life just does not make any sense. Going to school, going to work, going to church, you suddenly feel a stranger to your own life. You question the meaning of your existence, and because of that, the stage collapses and you feel separated from the world. Ooh. The feeling of separation, of divorce. This is what Camus' absurd is. The absurd occurs when the stage collapses, when the wise arises, when the rhythm of everyday life becomes broken. Part number 2. What exactly is the absurd? But what exactly is the absurd? Camus gave different interpretations of what the absurd really is. Absurd as a feeling is an example. According to him, people first encounter the absurd as a feeling. He also said the revolt of the flesh is the absurd, and the dances and strangeness of the world is the absurd. But the clearest definition may perhaps be found in the following statements. The absurd is born of this confrontation between human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. Absurd refers to the conflict between the human tendency to seek inherent value and meaning in life and the human inability to find any. In this context, absurd does not mean logically impossible, but rather humanly impossible. The universe and the human mind do not each separately cause the absurd, but rather the absurd arises by the contradictory nature of the two existing simultaneously. It is therefore the feeling of divorce, the feeling of separations from the world. It lies in neither of the elements compared. It is born of their confrontation. What makes life absurd is not the fact that it is meaningless. What life absurd is the distance between what man wants and what the world offers him. It is the futility of a search for meaning in an incomprehensible universe, devoid of God or meaning. Despite whatever hope, dreams, or expectation we furnish, despite all the efforts we put through, the world does not deliver what we yearn for, and does not care what happens to us. That is what makes life absurd. And in turn, Camus wanted to find out. Does the absurd dictate dead? Question mark.
Part 3, Absurdity and Suicide. Camus actually started this essay off with the assertion that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions and that the one philosophical problem is that of suicide. Is life worth or not worth living? That is what he supposedly wanted to ask. Camus nursed the idea that there might be a relationship between individual thought and suicide. He suggested that if we were to judge the importance of a philosophical problem by the consequences it entails, the problem of the meaning of life is certainly the most important. Someone who judges that life is not worth living will commit suicide, and those who feel that they have found some meaning to life may be inclined to die or kill to defend that meaning. Other philosophical problems do not entail such drastic consequences. And so much was his interest in suicide that he presented the following assumptions in the first part of his essay. His first assumption, consisted in the first line of his essay, was of course already mentioned. For him, there is only one philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Suicide is an act prepared within the silence of the heart. Man is ignorant of it, but he asserts that the worm is in man's heart. What sets off the crisis is almost always unverifiable. Camus suggested that there may have been catalysts to this event. Someone may have treated the suicidal person indifferently, and that may have been what influenced his decision to take his own life. I would just like to share my own thoughts about this. I agree with Camus in this part. I have always assumed that for a suicidal person, the feeling of wanting to take your own life away is not constant, and not always present, but could be permanent. There are just moments when these feelings are present, and these moments are determined by the presence of the urge to kill yourself. An urge usually triggered by something like a bad day at work, an argument with someone you hold dear, or even a failed school project. Suicide also amounts to some sort of confession. Camus suggests that suicide amounts to a confession that life is not worth living. He links this confession to what he calls the feeling of absurdity. Generally, we go through life believing that we carry a sense of meaning and purpose. We go through life with the belief that we do things for good and profound reasons. However, if allowed, we might come to see our daily actions and interactions as dictated primarily by the force of habit. We begin to cease to see ourselves as free agents and come to see ourselves almost as like machines, living mechanical lives. Holding on to this perspective, all our actions, desires, and reasons seems absurd and pointless. So with all these thoughts, one may wonder what is it with suicide that made Camus include it in his essay about the absurd. Well, according to Camus, most of the people who commit suicide are often assured of the meaning of life. Maybe that is why when the stage collapses, when the chain of daily life gets broken, they go down along with it. Now let's examine Camus' primary thoughts about the absurd. The feeling of absurdity is closely related to the feeling that life is meaningless. However, these two are not the same. Let's say you have caught up on the idea that life is not worth the trouble, no matter whatever reason it is that made you take the jump off the edge. If you take your own life, it suggests quite clearly that you reasoned out that life is better off without you, or you could not understand it anyway. When we realize that life is meaningless and that our existence is absurd, we feel separated from the world. This is because we have always carried the idea that we are part of a collective world, one where our lives hold universal meaning no matter how different we are. That feeling of being part of something makes us feel at home, that when we come face to face with absurdity, we become strangers to our own lives, like exiles. The absurd, therefore, is a feeling of separation and a feeling of divorce. And as Torres has already mentioned, it is also born out of the confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. As rational beings, we instinctively feel that life in the world itself has some sort of meaning and purpose. We therefore spend our entire lives searching for it or fooling ourselves that we have already found it. The world, however, is numb to our need for meaning. It cannot provide what we are looking for. The absurd cannot exist outside of man. In the same way, the absurd cannot exist outside of the world. For a moment, it is actually all that connects them together. Camus reflects. Neither the world nor the human mind is in itself absurd. Rather, absurdity finds itself in the confrontation between the two. Although usually first encountered as a feeling, the absurd is not only experienced with feelings but intellect as well. According to Camus, our desire for meaning is rooted in our desire to understand and to unify. Understanding the world for a man is reducing it to the human, stamping it with the seals. The mind that aims to understand reality can consider itself satisfied only by reducing it to the terms of thought. The nostalgia for unity, that appetite for the absolute, illustrates the essential impulse of the human drama. But its existence does not imply that it is to be satisfied. Camus knows that there is no truth, but there are only truths. But despite of the world's irrationality, people, including philosophers, insist on searching for the life's meaning, only to reach waterless deserts, a place where no objective meaning or value can be found. And as soon as they do, Camus knows that they were very eager to get out of it, either committing physical or philosophical suicide. Now, when we hear the term suicide, we usually think of physical suicide, the act of taking away your own life, literally away. However, this is not the only form of escape humanity has found, says Camus. Some try to escape the absurdity of existence or the waterless deserts through what we call philosophical suicide, and as quoted, it is initiating the suicide of thought in its purest revolt, and according to Camus, most philosophers are guilty of this. Camus remarks that existential philosophers generally try to avoid this confrontation with the absurd. Jaspers, for instance, claims to find transcendence by means of a totally illogical leap, just at the point where reason breaks down. Chestov, on the other hand, asserts that the absurd is God, suggesting that we need God only to help us deal with the impossible and incomprehensible. While Jasper said that does not fairly reveal beyond any possible explanation and interpretation not the absence but existence of transcendence, Chestov says that the only true solution is precisely where human judgment sees no solution. Otherwise, what need would we have of God? We turn toward God only to obtain the impossible. As for the possible, men suffice. There are two main types of philosophical suicide, according to Camus. This is when we turn either to the dazzling God of Kierkegaard or the absurd God of Husserl. Kierkegaard is famous for making the leap of faith into God, where he identifies the irrational with faith and with God. He makes of the absurd the criterion of the other world, whereas it is simply a residue of the experience of the world. In his failure, says Kierkegaard, the believer finds his triumph. Husserl's absurd God is a more complicated case, as his phenomenology, which deals only with the direct experience, seems to embrace the absurd, but then he tries to associate some sort of transcendental essences with the simple phenomena that he discusses. Camus is clear that he does not intend to discuss the thought of these philosophers as a whole, but simply their encounter with the absurd. Each of them tries somehow to resolve the conflict between human reason and an irrational universe in one way or another. Jaspers, Chestov, and Kierkegaard, all in their own way deny human reasons and fully embrace an irrational universe, associating that with God. Husserl, on the other hand, tries to deny the irrationality of the universe by finding reason in the phenomena of direct experience. As Camus has already noted, the absurd can only exist in the conflict between human reason and an irrational universe, and all four thinkers try to diffuse this conflict by negating one of the terms of the conflict. Existential philosophers try to find some sort of transcendence in the absurd itself. Camus insists that the logic of the absurd demands that there be no reconciliation or transcendence. These philosophers try to wriggle away from the logic posed to them by the absurd, and as such, they commit philosophical suicide. Now let's move on to the next question that Camus wanted to ask in his essay. He denoted that the two main ways of escaping the feeling of absurdity are suicide and hope. Suicide concludes that if life is meaningless, then it is not worth living. Hope denies that life is meaningless by means of blind faith. Are these really the only options that we have? Can we live without the hope that life is meaningful, but without the despair that leads to suicide? Now let's move on to part 4, which is the absurd freedom. Here, Camus introduced the idea of the absurd man. The absurd man, according to him, demands certainty above all else, and recognizes that he can only be certain of the absurd. The only truth about himself that remains constant is his desire for unity, reason, and clarity. And the only truth about the world that seems certain is that it conforms to no obvious shape or pattern. There may be a meaning to life, but there is no sure way of knowing what this meaning is. The absurd man wants to live only with what he can be sure of. The absurd is this conflict created between human reason and an unreasonable world, and it exists only so long as one is consciously aware of it. In order to cling to the absurd, then, the absurd man must obtain consciousness and awareness of this conflict within him without trying to overcome it. Therefore, it is time to ask the right question. It is time perhaps to ask the right question. Before we were asking if we can live without the hope that life is meaningful, or without the despair that leads to suicide, but maybe the right question to be asked is, does life have to have meaning to be lived? Camus says no. The answer is not suicide, but revolt. It now becomes clear, on the contrary, that it will be lived all the better if life has no meaning. Camus concludes this part of the essay by saying that the only way to overcome the absurd is to accept it, and from accepting it, you find yourself with three consequences: revolt, freedom, and passion. Revolt is the constant confrontation between man and his own obscurity. His revolt is living in the perpetual state of conflict characterized by the absurd. He must not cease to yearn for unity and order, but he must also remain aware that this unity and order is impossible. His revolt is without hope for resolution. This may seem a bit of an odd notion, for how can one be in a state of revolt? How can one struggle if one has no hope of success? One must revolt against being defeated by the absurd by keeping it in constant view, rather than suppressing it or committing suicide as an escape. True freedom for Camus is the freedom from false beliefs and hopes, living your life without the notion of that it is dictated by the government or religion, for instance. Camus asks, to what extent can we do and think what we want to do here on earth? The opposite of freedom, then, is not a person restrained by the laws of physics, but a person restrained by a repressive government or by his own timidity, earthly, alterable influences. The absurd man is free in this sense because he has abandoned the idea that his life has any value or any meaning, and so does not feel committed to living toward any particular goal. As a result, he faces every new moment free from the constraints of thoughts and actions that we normally conform to in society. People must achieve freedom from the false illusions that they use to give their lives meaning, an earthly freedom. And the last consequence, but probably the most important, is passion. The struggle itself towards the top is enough to fill a man's heart. What counts is not the best living, but the most living. The passion that Camus refers to as the final consequence of living the absurd is a matter of living in the present. Because the absurd man is not concerned with the future and is not preoccupied with the past, the present moment seems that much more intense and alive to him. And now, Part 5, The Myth of Sisyphus, Analysis and Conclusion. Sisyphus' punishment actually represents the human condition. The gods had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly rolling a rock to the top of a mountain, whence the stone would fall back of its own weight. They had thought, with some reason, that there is no more dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor. The story of Sisyphus is the epitome of the human condition, and that human beings cannot escape the condemnation of futile labor. He is crowned therefore as the absurd hero by Camus, as the title suggests. But why is he the absurd hero? Sisyphus endures his fate, but what makes him heroic is not just that he suffers his fate, it is because he is superior to it. Sisyphus does not weep and lament his state and condition. Out of scorn for the gods who condemn him to this fate, he affirms his labor and concludes that all is well. Fixing his eye on the stone at the bottom of the hill, he trudges down the slope to retrieve it. As obvious from the title of the essay, Sisyphus was the main hero in the essay. So the moment in Sisyphus' story that was most important to Albert Camus is when Sisyphus gains consciousness of his futile labor. There is one specific moment, during that return, that pause, at each of these moments when Sisyphus leaves the height and gradually sinks toward the layers of the god, he is superior to his fate, he is stronger than his rock. Sisyphus becomes stronger than his rock because he is conscious and content with his sentence. Camus even wrote, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Consciousness is key." This is what makes Sisyphus an absurd hero. He is completely aware of his fate in a constant cycle of futile labor. This moment of realization for Sisyphus relates perfectly to the three consequences of the absurd that Camus outlines at the end of his essay. The three consequences were passion, revolt, and freedom. Camus concludes that Sisyphus is happy because the fact that life has no meaning is what makes it worth living, and the perfect introduction to passion, which is the commitment to life even though it is meaningless. And that is all for our report. Thank you very much for listening.